One, two, three. All right, here we go. Film movements. This is the last video in the series for sure this time. I've only got 3 movements, so this should be a quick video. Let's get started. First one, no wave. This is a New York City film movement, which arose from the underground art scene. It took inspiration for the name from the parallel musical movement, which was taking place at the time. It's centered around a more avant-garde approach, attempting to challenge some conventions of filmmaking, as many film movements did. It did start late 70s, mid 70s, but 70s was packed, so it's in the 80s here. It went from about 1976 to 1985. This was a low-budget movement, which attempted to capture some unfiltered ideas and depictions of, people in New York City itself, really. It often had sort of rough, grainy, unfiltered sort of presentation to it. Sometimes black and white, sometimes in color. The city itself was a character in many of the films, as most of the inhabitants lived in New York City, even though in some cases other locations were featured. And I think clearly some of these films show a lot of love for New York City, despite not showing just its positives. I think especially in something like Smithereens, you see negatives of the city, negatives of the people, but nonetheless, there's a certain admiration and a love for the city, despite its flaws. The most notable filmmaker is Jim Jarmusch, who would go on to make other notable movies outside the wave, and still is working to this day, I believe. He's made other films such as Patterson and Only Lovers Left Alive. Still working to this day, he is a notable figure in indie filmmaking, even outside of getting his start in no wave. His main contribution to the movement is Stranger Than Paradise. This is a film about 3 young New York City inhabitants who search across the country for connection and purpose. It has the characteristic of New York City as a central character. It has a simple, stripped-down look, very bare-bones film, not even a lot of camera movement or anything like that. Shot in black and white, a very grainy aesthetic. It captures all of the characteristics of the movement quite well. And then a second notable entry, as I mentioned earlier, is Smithereens. This focuses more on New York City's punk scene, and specifically the main character as she evolves and we see some of her relationships and some of the city as she goes about her daily life, which is a bit turbulent. Next, Hong Kong New Wave. This movement also started in the late 70s, but again, this is primarily 80s and even technically continues to this day, I think, even though it seems like the bulk of the recognized works go through the early 2000s. This is not a defined stylistic movement. Much like New Hollywood, it is more of a new generation of filmmakers, rather than one specific stylistic idea. Hong Kong New Wave is composed of 2 different waves, one recognized as late 70s to mid 80s, and the other one continuing afterwards. I did see one source that said the second wave was more associated with international influence, but I only saw that the one place, so I'm not sure how much stock to put into it, but anecdotally, I think that makes some sense. Up to this point, the region was mostly known for its kung fu films, which is not a bad reputation to have, but some of the filmmakers had started to feel like the scene was a bit stagnant, and they did not ultimately move away entirely from kung fu films, as a couple of the most legendary directors from this time period did direct action films, but there was an increased effort to make something different, something richer than the perhaps lazy output the country had been drifting towards. And like I said, many filmmakers, especially in the second wave, took influence from foreign filmmakers like European art house, French New Wave, of course, and New Hollywood. I'll highlight 4 directors, 2 of which represent more action-type films, and 2 of which are more what you would expect, I suppose, from art house, New Wave type of movies. 2 action directors. First is John Woo. He is a legendary director, of course, even outside the context of this wave. Many people are familiar with his work. He has made some of the best-regarded action films of all time, including titles like The Killer and Hard Boiled. Tsui Hark is another action filmmaker, perhaps less well-known, not a household name, but nonetheless with a lot of well-regarded output in Hong Kong action. Probably most well-known for his Once Upon a Time in China series, but made many types of action movies, ranging from fantastical to romantic to comedic. 2 other directors, kind of feels wrong to relegate Wong Kar-wai to the other directors section, but whatever. Wong Kar-wai is a legend of cinema, Also not a household name, I don't think, because I had never heard of him before I started getting into film, and I kind of doubt a lot of mainstream audiences would. But he is certainly a legend in art house and independent cinema. Probably is in Hong Kong as well. Actually, that's an interesting question. Don't really know many people from Hong Kong, so I don't have an answer for that offhand. He is a director who's most well known for his lush visual style, often use of music in conjunction with that as well. In a film like In the Mood for Love, for example, which is regarded as one of the best romances of all time. He has made any number of highly regarded films, including Chungking Express and Fallen Angels, even the sequel to In the Mood for Love, 2046. A lot of beautiful work, a lot of stuff to appreciate in his work, not just the aesthetics, but also some romantic qualities, human nature. He has also made films that are outside the romance genre. For example, he did an Ip Man movie, The Grandmaster, but his output is esteemed for a very good reason. And then the fourth director is Anne Hui. She is a more humanistic filmmaker, slightly simpler films in a certain way, but complex in their humanity in another way. In movies like Boat People and Summer Snow, she focuses on marginalized people groups. Although I have heard some pushback against Boat People for some of the way it depicts people and places and events. Regardless, she is another well-regarded filmmaker from this wave. Last, Cinema du Look. This is yet another French film movement. There is a very good reason they have one of the best cinematic traditions of any country. This movement is more aesthetically based, driven by the current climate of France and the changing demands of a younger audience. There was a perceived demand for visual and sensory experiences at this time. This drove the movement both in similar and opposite directions as the French New Wave. A similar direction in terms of experimentation and uniqueness, breaking from certain norms. But at the same time, an opposite direction in terms of this movement being less critical, we'll say, less heady, more, you could almost describe it as more impulsive and humanistic. Not that French New Wave films are not humanistic, right? Like you got the 400 Blows or something like that, and Hiroshima Mon Amour, but I think almost impulsive feels like the right word, even though it's kind of a strange one for a film. These films tended to focus on younger people, usually representing the actual youth of France in urban environments. Its main influence on global cinema has been the visual style, with directors like Gaspar Noé and Wong Kar-wai, for example, citing Cinema du Look as examples, or as influences on their filmmaking. There are essentially three directors to focus on for Cinema du Look. They would be Jean-Jacques, Luc Besson, and Léo Carra. Beignet directed the first film in the movement, Diva, as well as one of the best regarded in the movement, Betty Blue. His directing more or less began and ended with those three movies. He has done other things, but those are easily his most recognized contributions to cinema. Luc Besson is the most recognizable name on the list, given that he eventually made the transition to Hollywood and made notable films like Léon the Professional and The Fifth Element. But initially, he was in France in Cinema du Look. For the movement, his most notable works are Subway and The Big Blue. Léo Carra is maybe a middle ground between the two in terms of influence. He directed several films within this movement and has made others outside of the movement in more recent times. His most well-known movie might be Holy Motors, well, maybe not most well-known. Combination of well-known and well-received. Might be Holy Motors. He also directed a movie with Adam Driver, whose name I'm blanking on, a few years ago. But within the movement, I think his most representative work is Boy Meets Girl, which I think is great for, if I had to pick one movie to represent this movement, it would be Boy Meets Girl. I think it highlights the main features like the disillusioned youth and the aesthetic style, even though this movie is black and white. And you might expect something like, for instance, Subway, which has more colorful visual flair to meet the criteria. The photography is quite nice in the movie, and it has a style-forward feel despite, not like blasting your eyes out or anything like that. So those are the three movements, and that's it for the series. And I will maybe try making more historical videos. It seems like people are more interested and will randomly watch videos about old movies or cinematic topics they don't know about. So I will probably try to focus on stuff like that because gotta get those views, right? So I will see you in the next video, whatever that may be.